The morning started like any other. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. I stretched, yawned, and shuffled downstairs, following the familiar scent of coffee and toast. My mother was in the kitchen, as she always was, humming softly to herself while she stirred a pot of oatmeal. I smiled, grabbing a plate from the cupboard and sliding into my usual seat at the table. "Morning, Mom," I said, pouring myself a glass of orange juice. She turned to me, and that's when I noticed something was off. Her eyes, usually warm and full of life, were empty, almost hollow. She stared at me for a moment, her head tilting slightly, as if she were trying to place me. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice calm but distant. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. "What? Who are you?" she repeated, her tone unchanged. "And what are you doing in my house?" At first, I thought it was a joke. My mother had a dry sense of humor, and she loved pulling pranks. But the look on her face told me this wasn't one of them. There was no twinkle in her eye, no suppressed smile. Just a blank, almost robotic expression. "Mom, it's me," I said, forcing a laugh. "Your son. Come on, stop messing around." She didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the stove, stirring the oatmeal as if I hadn't said a word. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe she was sleepwalking. Or maybe she'd hit her head and was confused. But deep down, I knew it was something worse. I called my dad at work, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "Dad, something's wrong with Mom," I said as soon as he picked up. "She doesn't recognize me. She's acting weird." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Stay calm," he said finally. "I'll be home as soon as I can. Just keep an eye on her, okay?" I hung up and returned to the kitchen. My mother was still at the stove, her back to me. I approached her cautiously, like she was a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. "Mom," I said softly. "Are you feeling okay?" She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "Why do you keep calling me that? I'm not your mother." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about? Of course you're my mother. You've been my mother for 18 years. She shook her head, her expression cold. "You're mistaken. I don't have a son." By the time my dad got home, I was on the verge of a panic attack. My mother had retreated to the living room, where she sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't react when my dad walked in, didn't even look at him. "Honey," he said, kneeling in front of her. "It's me. Can you hear me?" She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. But then she said, "Who are you?" My dad's face went pale. He stood up, pulling me aside. "We need to take her to the hospital. Now." The doctors ran tests, blood work, brain scans, everything they could think of. But the results came back normal. There was no physical explanation for her behavior. No stroke, no tumor, no signs of dementia. She was perfectly healthy, at least on paper. But she wasn't my mother anymore. The woman who had raised me, who had kissed my scraped knees and cheered me on at soccer games, was gone. In her place was a stranger who looked at me with empty eyes and asked, over and over, "Who are you?" Over the next few days, things only got worse. My mother stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She would wander the house at night, muttering to herself in a language I didn't recognize. Sometimes she would scream, her voice echoing through the halls like a wounded animal. Other times she would sit in silence, her face twisted in a look of pure hatred. My dad tried to keep it together, but I could see the cracks forming. He stopped going to work, stopped answering his phone. He spent hours sitting by her side, begging her to remember him, to remember us. But she never did. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. I sat up, my heart racing, and saw the doorknob turn slowly. The door creaked open, and my mother stepped inside. She was holding a knife. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Then she lunged. I rolled off the bed just in time, the knife slashing through the air where my head had been. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. "Mom, stop. It's me." But she didn't stop. She came at me again, the knife glinting in the moonlight. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand and swung it at her, the base connecting with her head. She stumbled back, dropping the knife, and collapsed to the floor. I called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The police arrived first, followed by an ambulance. They took my mother away, strapped to a gurney, her eyes still empty, her lips moving silently. My dad and I sat in the living room, waiting for news. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The doctors called it a psychotic break. They said it was rare, but not unheard of. They said she might recover, or she might not. They said a lot of things, but none of it mattered. Because the woman they were talking about wasn't my mother. My mother was gone. A week later, my dad and I visited her in the psychiatric ward. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the trees. She didn't look at us when we walked in, didn't react when my dad said her name. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking. "It's me. Please, just look at me." She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of recognition, a spark of the woman she used to be. But then she smiled, a cold, twisted smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. "Now I'll have to finish what I started." We left the hospital in silence, the weight of her words hanging over us like a dark cloud. That night, I packed my bags and left for college, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the memory of her eyes, empty, hollow, and full of hate. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep inside, she's still there. Watching. Waiting. And one day, she'll come for me again.